There is a stretch of country between Scotland and England where, for 300 years, the law simply stopped working. No king could hold it. No army could tame it. The families who lived there survived by raiding, riding, and fighting, stealing cattle by moonlight, burning each other's farms, and answering to no crown but their own surname. The English and Scottish governments called them a plague. History calls them the Border Reivers. And their descendants, after being driven off that land, shipped to Ireland, and then shipped again across the Atlantic, became the people who settled the American frontier, the Scots-Irish. If your last name is on the list I'm about to count down, this may be the blood in your veins. Not the blood of kings in marble palaces, but something the American frontier valued far more. The blood of clans that produced the toughest, most stubborn, most ungovernable fighters in the British Isles, and then produced roughly 1 out of every 3 American presidents. Because here is the astonishing fact at the center of this whole story. This scattered, dispossessed, twice exiled people, Presbyterian farmers with a chip on their shoulder and a genius for survival, went on to give the United States more presidents than any other single ancestral group. Andrew Jackson, James Polk, James Buchanan, Woodrow Wilson. The list goes on. The men who called the shots on the American frontier and then in the White House very often carried a border clan name. Today, we're counting down 10 Scots-Irish surnames, the border clans and warrior families behind them, and the astonishing bloodlines they carried into America. And I'm going to be honest with you the whole way through, because the Scots-Irish story is buried under more romantic myth than almost any other, from fake ancient tartans to bogus clan crests. And you deserve the real history, not the gift shop version. Stay for number 1, the most feared riding clan of them all, a family so dangerous that a Scottish king personally hanged their chief, and whose name a man carried onto the surface of the moon. Let's count down. Number 10. Bell. We begin with a name that sounds gentle and was anything but. On the Anglo-Scottish border, the Bells were a riding family, one of the kin groups who lived by the Reivers' code of raid and feud along the Western March, in the debatable lands where Scotland and England blurred into lawless country. Like their neighbors, they rode by night, lifted cattle, and settled scores with steel. When the crackdown came after 1603, and the Crown moved to break the reiver families for good, the Bells were among those pushed across the sea into Ulster, and from Ulster their descendants poured into colonial America. The surname Bell has more than one possible origin, which is part of what makes it interesting. It may come from the old French belle, meaning handsome or fair. It may be occupational, for a bell ringer or bell maker, or it may be a location name, for someone who lived by a prominent bell or sign. On the border, it simply became the name of a fighting family, and it carried one of the most consequential minds in human history. Alexander Graham Bell, the inventor of the telephone, descended from this Scottish stock. From a border raiding clan to the man who let human beings speak across continents, the Bell name traveled a very long way from the moonlit cattle raid. Number 9. Scott. Some surnames tell you exactly where a family came from. Scott is one of them. It literally means a Scot, a person from Scotland, a name given to Gaelic-speaking people who had settled among others. But on the border, the Scots were far more than a label. They were one of the largest and most powerful riding clans of the entire frontier, centered in the valleys around Teviotdale and Howick, capable of putting hundreds of armed horsemen in the field. In the endless border skirmishes, the Scots rode alongside the Kerrs and the Douglases, and their name runs through centuries of ballad and battle. When the reiver families were broken and dispersed, Scots scattered to Ulster and then to America in enormous numbers, which is exactly why it remains such a common surname across the American South today. The name's origin is as straightforward as it gets. It marks a Scot, someone identified by their nation. But the family that wore it became one of the defining powers of the borderland, and later gave the world the writer Sir Walter Scott, who did more than anyone to romanticize the very Highland and border imagery we'll spend part of this video separating from fact. If your name is Scott, your thread runs straight back into one of the great riding clans of the frontier. Number 8. Graham. The Grahams were, by the accounting of the border itself, one of the most numerous and troublesome riding families of all. So much so that after 1603, the English crown singled them out for especially harsh treatment, deliberately breaking up and deporting Graham families it considered incorrigible. Along the Western March, the Grahams straddled the line between England and Scotland, their loyalties following kin rather than country, and they were deeply entangled in the raiding economy of the frontier. When the authorities moved to pacify the border, whole communities of Grahams were forcibly transported, some to Ireland, some pressed into military service abroad, in one of the more aggressive acts of ethnic clearance in British history. From those scattered families, the Graham name traveled through Ulster and into the American backcountry. The surname Graham is a place name, most likely from Grantham in Lincolnshire, brought north into Scotland by a Norman family in the 12th century, meaning that behind this fierce border clan sits an aristocratic Norman origin, the kind of genuine noble root that does turn up in some of these names. And the Graham line carried its own kind of fame across the water. The middle name of Alexander Graham Bell was itself a tribute to that Scottish heritage. From a Norman noble family, to a hunted border clan, to the American frontier, Graham is one of the names where the noble bloodline framing actually holds real weight. Number 7. Johnston. Here is a name at the very heart of the border's most violent feuds, and a lesson in how surname spelling means less than people think. The Johnstons, sometimes spelled Johnstone, were one of the dominant riding clans of the Western March, and their generations-long blood feud with the Maxwell family is one of the most famous and lethal rivalries in all of border history. A cycle of raids, killings, and revenge that filled graveyards on both sides. To be a Johnston on the frontier was to be born into that war. When the reiver world was dismantled, Johnstons moved to Ulster in large numbers, and their descendants became a major thread in the Scots-Irish migration to America. The surname Johnston is a place name. It means John's town, or the settlement of a man named John, and it's easily confused with Johnson, which is a patronymic meaning son of John. They're different names with different origins, endlessly muddled by clerks and census takers over the centuries, which is a perfect illustration of a rule that runs through this entire subject. Spelling is not destiny. Families change the spelling of their names constantly, and two people spelling it differently can share the same border ancestor, while two people spelling it identically may not be related at all. Among the Scots-Irish descendants carrying this name into American history was President Andrew Johnson, the spelling worn smooth, the border blood still running underneath. Number 6. Kerr. If you've ever heard that left-handed people were once called Kerr-handed in parts of Scotland and northern England, you've brushed up against the legend of this family. Because the Kerrs were said to be a clan of left-handed swordsmen who built their castle staircases to spiral the opposite way, giving a left-handed defender the advantage. Whether or not that story is literally true, the Kerrs were unquestionably one of the great riding clans of the border, powerful around Teviotdale, and rivals and allies by turns to the Scots and the other frontier families. They rode, they raided, they feuded, and they held real regional power in the lawless centuries before 1603. And, like every name on this list, when the Crown broke the reiver system, the Kerrs dispersed to Ulster and onward to America, where the name often shifted its spelling to Carr, another reminder that the same family can wear several spellings. The surname Kerr comes from a Norse and Northern English word for rough or marshy ground, or a patch of wetland, a landscape name identifying a family by the boggy border country they lived on. There's nothing noble in the origin. It's pure frontier geography. But it belonged to one of the fiercest riding clans of the March, and the left-handed swordsman legend, true or not, captures something real about how these families were remembered, as fighters, first and always. We're halfway through, and we still haven't reached the clans that produced the men who fought the American Revolution on the frontier, or the #1 riding family whose name reached the moon. If one of these names belongs to your family, tell me in the comments, and tell me whether you grew up hearing you were Scottish, Irish, or Scots-Irish, because the difference is exactly the tangled story this whole video is about. I read every comment, and the names people share shape which videos I make next. And if you're finding this worthwhile, subscribe to Surname Origins. This channel digs up the real, documented history buried inside everyday names, and tells you honestly where the truth ends and the gift shop legend begins. New deep dives every week. Now, back to the countdown and the names that settled the frontier. Number 5. Campbell. We leave the border for a moment and go north, into the Highlands, for one of the largest and most powerful clan names in all of Scotland, and one of the most controversial. Clan Campbell was a Highland dynasty of enormous reach, centered in Argyll on Scotland's west coast, led by the chiefs who became the Dukes of Argyll, genuine, top-tier Scottish nobility. The Campbells were masters of aligning themselves with the winning side of Scottish and British politics, which made them powerful, wealthy, and widely resented. The name is still shadowed in some quarters by the Campbells' role in the notorious massacre of Glencoe in 1692. From Argyll, Campbells crossed the short sea passage to Ulster in large numbers during the plantation era, and from there joined the flood into Appalachia, where Campbell became one of the most common Scots-Irish surnames in America. The surname Campbell comes from the Gaelic Camboul, meaning crooked mouth, originally a personal nickname, perhaps for an ancestor with a distinctive expression or a sharp way of speaking. It's a rare thing on this list, a name attached to a family of real, documented ducal nobility. If your name is Campbell, your line may run back not to a border raider, but to one of the great noble houses of the Scottish Highlands, with all the power and all the controversy that carried. Number 4. Stewart. No surname on this list carries a more literally royal origin than Stewart, because the Stewarts were quite simply the royal family of Scotland. the name began as a job title. A steward was the high official who managed a royal household and estates, and the high stewards of Scotland held that office at the very top of the medieval kingdom. In the 14th century, that family inherited the throne itself, and the House of Stewart went on to rule Scotland, and later all of Britain, for centuries, through Mary, Queen of Scots, through the union of the crowns, down to the Stuart kings of England. This is about as close to a royal bloodline as any surname in the English-speaking world can genuinely get. But here is the crucial honesty this video is built on. The fact that the royal Stuarts existed does not mean every Stuart descends from them. The name became extraordinarily common precisely because stewards served in noble households all over Scotland, and because the prestige of the royal name led many unrelated families to carry it. Stewards and stewards of every social rank crossed to Ulster and then to America in huge numbers, and Scots-Irish Stuart blood ran into American life at every level, including, by some accounts, into presidential ancestry. If your name is Stewart, you carry a name that was genuinely royal, but a shared name with a dynasty is a thread to investigate, never a certificate of descent. Number 3. Wallace. Few surnames carry as much emotional weight in Scottish memory as Wallace, the name of William Wallace, the freedom fighter who led Scottish resistance against English domination at the end of the 13th century and became the enduring symbol of Scottish independence. The Wallace family were part of the fabric of medieval southwestern Scotland, and the name became a rallying cry for Scottish identity itself. Wallaces were among the lowland Scots who moved to Ulster during the plantation, and from there the name traveled into the Scots-Irish diaspora and across Appalachia, carried by families who took a deep, stubborn pride in it. The surname Wallace is genuinely fascinating in its origin because it comes from a word meaning, essentially, foreigner or Welshman, from the same root that gives us Welsh and Wales. It was used by the Scots to describe the Britons of the old kingdom of Strathclyde in southwestern Scotland, people who spoke a Celtic tongue closer to Welsh than to Gaelic. So the great symbol of Scottish nationhood carried a name that literally meant the foreigner, a beautiful irony buried inside one of Scotland's proudest surnames. If your name is Wallace, your thread runs back to the ancient Britons of Strathclyde and forward through one of history's most famous fights for freedom. Number 2. Jackson. This is the name that sits at the absolute center of the Scots-Irish story in America, because it belonged to the man who became the very embodiment of the frontier in the White House. Andrew Jackson's parents emigrated from County Antrim in Ulster just 2 years before he was born, making him about as purely Scots-Irish as an American president can be. And Jackson carried the entire temperament of his people into national life: fierce, stubborn, loyal to kin, suspicious of distant elites, quick to fight, and utterly unwilling to back down. He was a duelist, a general, and a populist, and whatever one makes of his deeply mixed and often brutal legacy, he was the Scots-Irish frontier made flesh, the backcountry Presbyterian farmer's grandson who stormed into Washington and remade the presidency in his own image. The surname Jackson is a patronymic. It simply means son of Jack, Jack being a medieval nickname for John, one of the great family of English and Scottish son of names. There's nothing noble in it. It's about as common and ordinary an origin as a surname can have. And that's exactly the point of the Scots-Irish story. this wasn't a people who ruled by inherited title. They earned their place through sheer force of will on the hardest ground in America, and a man with an ordinary son of Jack surname, born to immigrants fresh off the boat from Ulster, became one of the most consequential presidents in the nation's history. Number 1. Armstrong. And now, number 1. The most feared riding clan of the entire Anglo-Scottish border, and the name that traveled farther than any surname in human history. At the height of their power in the early 16th century, the Armstrongs of Liddesdale were the terror of the western frontier. They could reportedly field several thousand mounted men. They answered to no government, and they raided both sides of the border with such impunity that they effectively ruled their own lawless kingdom in the debatable lands. They were so powerful and so ungovernable that the King of Scotland himself, James V, resorted to treachery to break them. He lured the Armstrong chief, Johnny Armstrong of Gilnockie, to a meeting under the pretense of friendship in 1530, and then had him and his men hanged on the spot. It was a calculated act of royal terror against a family the crown could not defeat in open battle, and it became one of the great tragic ballads of the border. Broken but not erased, the Armstrongs were among the reiver families driven into Ulster, planting the name deep in the Irish counties of Fermanagh and Tyrone, and from there Armstrong emigrants carried it into Pennsylvania, the Carolinas, and the Appalachian frontier in the great Scots-Irish migration. The name means exactly what it sounds like, from the Old English for strong arm, a nickname said to have been earned by an ancestor of such physical power that he could lift a fallen knight in full armor. It is a warrior's name to its very root, and it traveled the farthest of any name humanity has ever carried. On July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong, descendant of that feared border clan of horse-riding raiders, became the first human being to set foot on the moon. Think about the arc of that. From a family of moonlight cattle raiders on the lawless Scottish border, hanged by kings and driven across 2 oceans, to the first bootprint in the lunar dust. No surname on earth has ever made a longer journey. If your name is Armstrong, that is the blood you carry, the strong arm, the riding clan, the name that reached the moon. 10 names, 10 clans and families who were too tough for kings to govern, too stubborn to stay conquered, and who turned their centuries of hardship on the border and in Ulster into the raw material that settled the American frontier. But I promised you honesty, and the Scots-Irish story needs it more than most, because it's wrapped in more invented tradition than almost any heritage in the world. So here's the truth. Those colorful, ancient clan tartans you see in every gift shop? Largely a 19th century invention, romanticized long after the Reivers were gone. The idea that Massey is Irish and Mac is Scottish? A myth. They're the same word, abbreviated 2 ways, on both sides of the water. And a shared surname, as always, is not proof of descent from any clan chief or president. These names were carried by thousands of unrelated families, and the spelling shifted so freely over the centuries that Kerr and Carr, Johnston and Johnston are often the very same line. But here is what is real, and what no gift shop myth can take away. There genuinely was a people forged on the most violent frontier in the British Isles, raided and raiding, feuding and surviving, cleared off their land and shipped to Ulster, then squeezed out of Ulster and shipped across the Atlantic, and that people genuinely did become the backbone of the American frontier and did give the young United States roughly 1/3 of its presidents, and did carry names like Armstrong from a moonlit cattle raid all the way to the moon itself. You don't need a fake tartan to be proud of that. The real history is far better than the legend. If one of these names is yours, tell me in the comments, and tell me the story your family passed down, whether it's the documented truth or the cherished legend. Both are worth knowing, as long as you know which is which. Subscribe to Surname Origins for a new surname origin video every week. Your last name isn't just a name. It's the end of a very long thread. And now you know a little more about where it leads.